Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to Carpo's channel. That's me, Carpo. This video, it's interesting because before I made this, I actually have so many different ideas going through my head. I had two different topics I wanted to talk about, but something drew me to talk about how power corrupts. And then once I thought about it for a few minutes, I realized that it completely ties in perfectly with the other topics I was already going to discuss. Pretty much anytime you bring up something about society's woes, ills, problems, it often comes down to power. People in positions of power who abuse that power, which is a phenomenon that goes back as far as humanity. Somebody is always going to try to take more than their share. The question is, do the wealthy really contribute as much as they say to society? And what are the real stats involving, how corrupt people actually are in positions of power versus your average citizen who may not be in the public eye, so therefore nobody's keeping tabs on the average citizen, so to speak. Anyhow, there have been a lot of studies done on power and the corruption of people by that power. There have been studies done where one Monopoly player was given more money to start, and each time they pass go, they collect 200 instead of 100. It's a well-known study where by the end of the experiment, they were acting more cocky, more arrogant, more entitled. The people who started off with an uneven footing, let's just say. And this was an experiment that was done more to show the difference between how those who are born into wealth do compared to those who have to struggle to get ahead. In the end, even the people in that Monopoly game who had started with more money and who collected more each time they passed go, by the end they were asked a series of questions, and almost every time they tried to justify their win with something other than their unfair advantage by saying, "Oh, I'm a better player." Monopoly is just a game of luck, but in real life it's not, because people do start with more. Does this extend into the CEOs and into, every facet of politics everywhere else? Yes, of course it does. So before I continue, I'd like to read this one little article I was perusing earlier, and I thought this article might sum it up. It's a PBS article from I don't know how many years ago, but it was a conversation between two people about the corruption of power. And they were talking about these types of experiments. And so what she says is, "Here's one of my favorites. I could not believe this finding. Investigators were interested in who's more likely to shoplift. Shoplifting costs America over $10 billion a year. So the question is, who is likely to walk into the store and pocket something that they don't pay for? And, indeed, it is high-power, wealthier people who are more likely to shoplift. There are famous car studies with Paul Piff that look at who's more likely to blaze through a pedestrian zone on the road and think that their time is more important than the safety of the pedestrian. It's people driving more high-power, wealthier cars. Everywhere you turn, you see this finding that power makes us feel entitled to more." Now a person could chalk this up to bad statistics. I can't tell you whether wealthy people shoplift more than those who aren't. We know that the poor shoplift to survive. This isn't probably included in the study. This is probably shoplifting for the novelty of shoplifting. And indeed, you hear about little rich girls getting caught all the time for stealing things. Well, it's like an excitement. It's not about what you're getting a lot of the time. But it gives an interesting perspective into the mindset. The part with the cars and how people with nicer cars would tend to blow through a pedestrian walkway, I have seen this firsthand a million times. I'll come up to a four-way stop and stop. The other person's still coming up and they just blaze right in front of me. Every time I'm cut off by a car, it's either a guy in a really nice car or a guy in a sports car who just wants to drive fast, which doesn't mean that they're wealthy, but maybe they're just wanting to drive faster. That's different. When it comes to rich people, often it's not about getting there quicker. It's just they feel more entitled than you are. So anyway, the article goes on, and the next question Paul asks is, so what do you do about it? And Dasher Keltner is the name of the other person, says, I think that's the great question of societies. Studies are finding, and it's very intuitive, that if you make people feel accountable and say, Paul, a committee is evaluating how you allocate these resources, and you're in a position of power and now allocate the resources, you can become more ethical in how you allocate the resources. And then it goes on to talk about accountability. And this is pretty much, I could sum it up, and I think we all could. And this goes back to something I said the other day, and it just reinforces this, two-term or two-word that I thought of as the problem we have with power in this society, which is there's no accountability and there's no accessibility, meaning that not only are the people not held accountable for their actions, their stupidity, their bad decisions, they're also not even accessible so the average person can do anything about it or complain. So nobody's holding anyone to any standards. In fact, that's just the American way for a lot of people. Get ahead, whatever it takes. And it's interesting, they've found in a lot of these studies that people who are higher up on the rung at work are 75% more likely, 3 out of 4 times somebody is mean to someone, says something disparaging, or is insulting to somebody. It's a person in a higher ranking position in the company. And this is seen in the micro and the macrocosm in human societies, right? Think about, in the past, how rulers ruled the land with an iron fist under the illusion of divine rule. In fact, most leaders through history have taken their positions in Western countries, at least, by positioning themselves with those who are wealthy and claiming that God favors them because they're positioned as such. In other words, people would believe since a person is doing well and they're rich, then they must be a great leader. Even though that goes completely against the whole point that they got rich probably off of benefiting from the people's money. This is something that's well known. You don't earn that much money unless you can convince others to get rid of some of theirs and give it to you, for whatever it may be. All through history it's been this way. And it's interesting that one aspect is he who has the most money has the most to lose. And therefore they are the most likely to protect themselves, their assets, their opinions, their decisions that they make. And they're the most likely to tell others that they don't know what they're talking about because, well, you're in your position because that's, the old idea that if you're poor, it's your own fault. Which, sure, in a lot of cases that's true, but in more cases than not, it's a little more complicated than that. Society is set up for people in power. So here's the thing. The fact that people are in power or have positions of power isn't the problem. It's not about anarchy and every man for himself, because we as humans, we seek out leadership. We want people who can help us to understand our world and to do the work that we don't want to do. It's the same reason we hire people to do things like policing, and that's the problem with policing as well. The very root of the problem is the fact that they are given too much power. Once again, in positions of power, police will abuse people, beat them down, kick in doors, have no accountability for their actions. And I think that's one of the biggest issues with it. Even if they kick in the wrong door and they destroy your house looking for someone and they find out, whoops, we had the wrong address, which happens regularly with these SWAT teams dressed in riot gear, kicking down doors with machine guns and, flashbangs in people's houses and killing pets and basically saying, we apologize. Once in a while a lawsuit can go through and they might get sued, but then that comes out of our tax dollars. But still, where's the actual apologies from the officers who did it? Many times when a cop has that much power, they believe they are untouchable, completely untouchable. So, darn it. I got cut off for a second there. But I don't want to go back and finish this video a second time. So another aspect of this is that the laws that we have cause a lot of the crime and drugs, and often the people are blamed for, being the problem of society. I thought about this earlier. It's interesting that You think about criminal actions and how many people are afraid of criminals breaking into their house and stealing their goods, right? Which is such a huge problem. They steal your car, your bicycle. But in the big picture, for most people, how often are you actually robbed in one lifetime? And in those robberies, how much did you actually lose? Now, this is going to vary by the individual, but my thought was that often if a person's robbed once, the feeling is so intrusive that it gives them PTSD, they never feel safe again. And, this could be from, even the police doing something like that. But often, it could be like an illegal seizure. These things happen all the time, too. These things can scar a person for life, right? And I thought about that. We don't even bat an eye half the time at the other criminals that steal so much more from us. And actually, we expect to be able to trust more than we do. For example, or more trustworthy than they are. In other words, for example, the bankers who raise rates or rip people off, and each year people are paying these fees and fines and little hidden charges on their bills for various things, and the government's taxing them and then taking their money and spending it on the military to go to wars we don't need to fight, and sending our soldiers over there. But we're more paranoid about losing the wealth that we have from our neighbor or somebody who's a stranger instead of those we know. And that's kind of a scary thing. In other words, the people who are in positions of power, for some reason we trust. And this is interesting because in the past I thought that people distrusted those with power. I really thought that more people, I guess I know a lot of people do. I didn't realize how many people trust the other people just because they have money and they say that they know what they're talking about. And the last election cycle told me this completely. More complicated than that, but it's not just here. We've got, these belligerent, completely, undemocratic leaders who rig elections, like in South America, for example. The U.S. has done plenty of that too, but even in their own countries, they have these coups, the military take other leaders hostage or threaten their families, things like that. And the people are even aware of it. But in their minds sometimes they think, well, this person's strong, he'll fight for what he believes. As in belligerence, arrogance, and spitting fire from a leader is a good thing. And sometimes it can be. You want somebody who can stand up to other countries and tyranny and even problems within their own country. This is understandable. But over the years I've realized that it's not that we had a lack of facts to understand these things. The internet's shown me that even when the facts are there, it's a choice. It's ignorance by choice. It's like one of those conundrums. Do we watch the media to understand the world? Of course not, because they're always lying. But then, if we don't listen to any media whatsoever, we don't know what the hell's going on in the world, and there's a certain obligation to understand these things. And that's why when you hear about corruption and these people doing things and abusing others, whether it be a CEO or a police officer, a politician, it angers you. And you think, why do I bother learning about this? It's not worth my time. Some people, on the other hand, want to be angry, and they just fill themselves with this. There are people who spend all day just watching videos complaining about other people and the problems of the world. And that's not a healthy way to live. But you should be aware of the corruption. And I think being aware of what creates that corruption and its power. So we have to limit power. It's not just limiting power, but a power check on the people who have it. And we don't do that. We trust them for some reason. We give some people too much power. Not only that, but we give other people's opinions too much power over us. And often those people just want to sway our opinion to buy their product or whatever it may be. We're worried about the wrong people in the wrong situations, quite often. Now you think about a power grab. I don't know if you've heard of Anom, but it was basically a cryptic phone service that was a messaging service from cell phones between drug dealers. This was in the news just yesterday, so this will be dated. But it was a few years back they shut down a bunch of these private messaging apps and busted a whole bunch of people. Well, after they shut down these apps, which send encrypted messages so nobody can get into them, right? The FBI, long story short, created their own, and then bided their time over the last few years and slowly sent it out to like 300 different gangs around the world and crept into these different dealers' pockets. They did a bust in like 16 countries simultaneously. Over 800 places were raided and hundreds of people arrested, I believe, and millions of dollars in average billions of dollars in drugs, weed, Bitcoin, everything you can imagine. But the big thing was they confiscated their Bitcoin, they confiscated all their drugs, everything they had, right? And I started wondering, well, I thought Bitcoin was safe, and then it wasn't in their wallet. It gets into all this complicated shit, but the main issue here is privacy. And what you would call entrapment. The FBI used a position of power and taxpayer money to create this huge loop in order to bust all these people for drugs. And I started thinking, there are so many better ways to do this. You could look right at the CIA. Been the biggest importer of drugs to this country for a long time. So anyway, that's a different story altogether. I just thought that was an interesting story and a show of power. And it should make everybody nervous that everybody's always being watched, not because you're doing anything wrong, but because it's just a strange time to live. The rich get richer because they know more and more about us, and it really turns into kind of a dystopian future. I hope not. I hope it gets better. Anyway, at least today, in this country where I live, you don't get the death penalty for speaking out, for saying how you feel, so I feel I might as well. Thanks for listening. Have a good day, and I'll talk to y'all next time. Peace out.